December 17th, 1944. 0647 hours. Frozen crossroads 3 kilometers west of St. Vith, Belgium. Sergeant Hans Waldmann pressed his eye against the rubber cup of his Panzer IV's periscope, watching his breath fog the glass in the pre-dawn darkness. Frost crystals traced geometric patterns across the steel hull around him, each one catching the pale light filtering through the low cloud ceiling. The radio crackled, 3rd Panzer Regiment reporting another column of American Shermans retreating west along the forest road. Easy prey. Target reference, Waldmann murmured into his throat microphone. Road junction, 11 o'clock, 800 meters. His gunner, Corporal Fritz Schneider, adjusted the traverse wheel. The 75mm KWBK-40 cannon rotated with a hydraulic whine that seemed too loud in the stillness before dawn. Through the trees lining the road, Waldmann could make out the distinctive shapes. 4 American M4 Shermans crawling through the snow like wounded animals. Their crews probably hadn't slept in days. They were running. Everyone was running from the German offensive that had erupted through the Ardennes forest 3 days earlier. Hitler's desperate gamble. A massive counterattack through the weakest point in the American line, just like they'd done to the French in 1940. And it was working. Range? Schneider's voice was steady. He'd been doing this since Kursk. 750, dropping. Waldmann watched the lead Sherman navigate around a destroyed American half-track, its tracks churning the snow into black slush. Lead tank. High explosive. Fire when ready. The Panzer IV rocked backward as the cannon spoke. The shells streaked across the misty gap and struck the Sherman's turret at an angle, detonating in a flash of orange that lit up the tree line. The American tank didn't penetrate. Waldmann knew it wouldn't. The 75mm on those Shermans couldn't punch through frontal armor at this range. They'd learned that in Normandy, in Holland, in 100 forest roads just like this one. The Sherman slewed sideways, smoke pouring from its engine deck. Waldmann could see figures bailing out, dropping into the snow, scrambling for the ditch. The other 3 Shermans were backing up now, trying to reverse into cover, their commanders screaming orders that Waldmann couldn't hear but could imagine perfectly well. "Second tank," he called. Same load. Another shot. Another hit. This one struck lower, where the hull met the tracks. The Sherman lurched to a stop, immobilized. 2 for 2. Waldmann had been killing Shermans for 6 months. The Americans called them the tank that won the war, but that was a joke among the Panzer crews. The Sherman was tall, poorly armored, and mounted a gun that couldn't penetrate German armor except at point-blank range. It was a rolling coffin, and American crews knew it. They called them Ronsons, guaranteed to light every time. The Americans tried to compensate with numbers. For every Panzer, there were 5 Shermans. But 5 Shermans meant nothing when the first 3 were burning before they got into effective range. Waldmann had seen entire platoons destroyed trying to rush German positions. Brave men, certainly. But bravery didn't stop an 88mm round. The remaining 2 Shermans were retreating now, disappearing into the forest fog. Waldmann didn't pursue. Orders were to hold the crossroads, control the intersection. Let the infantry and the Panthers handle the pursuit. His job was to make sure nothing came back east. "Reload," he said. "Armor piercing. Watch the western approach." His loader, young Klaus Hoffmann, barely 18, wrestled another shell into the breach. The boy's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from cold. They'd been sitting in this position for 4 hours, engine off to conserve fuel. The temperature inside the tank was maybe 2 degrees above freezing. Waldmann pulled back from the periscope and reached for his thermos. The coffee was cold, but it was still coffee. Through the hull, he could hear the distant rumble of artillery, the front lines shifting, always shifting. The Americans were in full retreat across the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Another few days and they'd break through to the Meuse River. Maybe even Antwerp. The radio crackled again. Company commander reporting 17 American tanks destroyed in the last 12 hours. 17. Waldmann had personally accounted for 6 of them. He took another sip of cold coffee and smiled. The Shermans were putting up a fight, he'd give them that. But a fight and a victory were different things. Schneider was humming something, that song they'd all been singing since the offensive started. Panzer Lied, the tank song. Waldmann found himself humming along, but 60 kilometers to the west in a snow-covered depot near Liège, something was changing. Staff Sergeant Joe Kowalski stood in the morning cold, watching a flatbed truck roll through the gates with a tarpaulin-covered load that looked like every other Sherman he'd seen in 2 years of war. Except it wasn't. "That's her?" his driver, Private Danny Chen, asked, stamping his feet against the cold. "That's her," Kowalski confirmed. He'd been told to expect the new model, but seeing it in person was different. The tarp came off, and there she was, the M4A-E8. The Easy 8. At first glance, it looked like any other Sherman. Same basic hull, same sloped front armor, same general profile that made German gunners smile. But Kowalski had been briefed. He knew what was different, and those differences were everything. The tracks were the first thing you noticed. Horizontal volute spring suspension, wider than the standard Sherman, giving the tank a lower, more stable profile. The turret was different too, housing a 76mm high-velocity gun instead of the old 75mm pop gun. And the whole thing sat differently, more balanced, more aggressive. "She doesn't look that special," Chen said. Kowalski climbed up onto the hull, running his hand along the turret. "The Germans have been killing Shermans for 2 years because we couldn't penetrate their armor, and they could hit us from 1,000 yards out. This gun," he slapped the 76mm barrel, "can punch through a Panther's front plate at 700 meters. The tracks give us better ground pressure in mud and snow. The suspension means we can fire on the move without losing accuracy. So we can finally fight back," Chen said. "We can finally fight back." 20 kilometers south, Lieutenant Karl Weber sat in his Panther Aus FG, the most feared tank on the Western Front, watching American positions through his commander's cupola. The Panther mounted an incredible 75mm KWK-42 gun, longer and more powerful than anything the Americans had. Its sloped armor could deflect almost anything the Allies threw at it. It was faster than a Sherman, better armored, and equipped with superior optics. Weber had destroyed 11 American tanks since crossing the German border. 11 Shermans that had tried and failed to stop the advance. The pattern was always the same. The Americans would appear, fire their inadequate guns, watch the rounds bounce off, then try to retreat before the Panther's superior gun found them. Most didn't make it. "Movement," his gunner reported. "American column, northwest sector." Weber raised his binoculars. More Shermans, probably trying to reinforce the collapsing American lines. He keyed his radio, alerting the other Panthers in his platoon. 4 Panthers against what looked like 8 Shermans. The Americans were learning to attack in larger groups, trying to overwhelm German positions with numbers. Sometimes it even worked, if they could get close enough and flank. But this was open ground. The Shermans would have to cross 500 meters of snow-covered field to reach cover. They wouldn't make it halfway. "Range?" Weber asked. 1,200 meters, closing. "Let them come to 1,000. Make every shot count." Ammunition was getting scarce. The supply lines were stretched thin and every shell mattered. The Shermans kept coming, turrets traversing, looking for targets. Weber watched them through his optics, noting their spacing, their formation. Textbook American tactics. Spread out, move fast, try to close the distance before the Germans could destroy them all. It had worked in Normandy when the hedgerows gave them cover. It didn't work here. Target, lead tank, fire. The Panther's gun roared. At this range, against a Sherman, it was almost unsporting. The round penetrated the Sherman's front armor like paper, and the tank exploded in a gout of flame that rose 20 feet into the winter sky. The other Shermans immediately began firing, but their shells fell short or ricocheted off the Panther's sloped armor with metallic clangs that Weber could hear even through the hull. Second tank, right flank, fire. Another hit. Another burning Sherman. The remaining 6 were trying to scatter now, some reversing, some trying to rush forward. coordination breaking down in panic. Weber's other 3 Panthers opened up, and within 90 seconds, 5 more Shermans were burning. The last one made it to a small depression and disappeared behind a rise. "Pursuit?" his gunner asked. "Negative. Let it go. Save ammunition." Weber watched the smoke from the burning tanks rise into the gray sky. 11 Shermans. Now 16. The Americans kept sending them, and the Germans kept destroying them. How long could that continue? But that evening, as Waldmann's Panzer IV crew ate cold rations in their tank, the radio brought news that made them pause. 3rd Company had engaged American armor near Manhay Shermans, but different ones. The initial report was confused. German tanks damaged. Multiple Panthers hit. The Americans had penetrated armor that should have been impregnable. "Probably got lucky," Schneider said, spooning cold stew from a tin. "Flanking shot caught them by surprise." But the reports kept coming. 4th Panzer Regiment engaged near Grand Mesnil. 2 Panthers destroyed, 3 damaged. The Americans had a new tank. Looked like a Sherman, fought like something else entirely. Could penetrate frontal armor at range, more maneuverable in the forest terrain. Waldmann exchanged glances with his crew. For 2 years they'd held the advantage. German tanks were better. Better armored, better armed, crewed by veterans who knew every trick. The Shermans were training targets. Dangerous only in numbers or at point-blank range. If that was changing. December 22nd, 1944. Forest Road east of Hotten, Belgium. The snow had stopped, but the temperature had dropped to -15 Celsius. Waldmann's Panzer IV sat in a defensive position overlooking a narrow valley, part of a screen meant to protect the northern flank of the German advance. The offensive was slowing. American reinforcements were arriving from all directions. Patton's Third Army was pushing up from the south. The 82nd and 101st Airborne had held Bastogne against all odds. And now these new tanks were appearing everywhere. "Contact," Schneider called. "Valley Road, 900 meters. Multiple targets." Waldmann pressed his eye to the periscope. 5 tanks, American, moving in a loose formation through the trees. They looked like Shermans, but something was different. Lower profile, wider tracks that distributed their weight better over the snow. They were moving faster than Shermans should be able to move in this terrain. "Engage lead tank," Waldmann ordered. "High explosive." The Panzer IV fired. The shell struck the lead tank's turret, but didn't penetrate. The round detonated against the armor without effect. Before Waldmann could process what had happened, the American tank's turret rotated with impossible speed and fired back. The world exploded. The German tank rocked sideways as the American round struck the front glacis at an angle, penetrating armor that had stopped every Sherman gun for 2 years. The shell didn't fully penetrate. The angle was too steep, but it cracked the armor plate and sent spalling fragments ricocheting through the crew compartment. Hoffman screamed. The young loader clutched his face, blood streaming between his fingers where a steel fragment had caught him. Waldmann felt something hot on his arm but ignored it. "Back! Reverse! Now!" he shouted at the driver. The Panzer IV lurched backward, engine roaring, but 2 more American tanks had already found firing positions. A second round hit the turret, and this time the penetration was complete. Schneider died instantly, slumping over his gun controls. The interior filled with smoke and the smell of burning flesh. Waldmann grabbed Hoffman and hauled him toward the escape hatch. "Out, everybody, out." They tumbled into the snow as a third round struck their abandoned tank, and the ammunition inside cooked off in a series of explosions that split the hull open like a tin can. Waldmann dragged Hoffman into the tree line, looking back just once to see the 5 American tanks advancing through the valley, their 76mm guns traversing, hunting for more targets. Those weren't Shermans, or rather, they were Shermans, but transformed into something the Germans hadn't planned for. Something that could fight back. Lieutenant Karl Weber received the reports with growing unease. His Panther platoon had been redeployed to meet the new American threat, but the first engagement had been a disaster. The new Sherman variant, intelligence was calling it the M4A3E8, The EZ-8 was proving far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The Americans had solved their gun problem. The 76mm cannon could penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at combat ranges, especially in the close-quarters forest fighting that defined the Ardennes. The improved suspension meant they could fire accurately while moving, turning the tank into a mobile gun platform rather than a static one. And those wider tracks gave them mobility in snow that German tanks couldn't match. Weber's platoon encountered them on Christmas Eve, in a running battle through the forest south of Mannheim. 3 Panthers against 4 EZ-8s. The Americans used the terrain brilliantly, appearing from behind ridges, firing, then disappearing before the Panthers could return effective fire. The forest was too dense for long-range engagements, where the Panthers' superior optics mattered. Everything happened at 300 meters or less. Weber's gunner got one EZ-8, a perfect shot through the side armor as it crested a hill. But the other 3 swarmed his position, moving through the trees with an agility that shouldn't have been possible for a 30-ton tank. One of them hit Weber's Panther in the turret ring, jamming the traverse. Another round struck the engine deck, and suddenly they were immobilized, unable to aim, sitting targets. "Abandoned tank!" Weber shouted. They bailed out seconds before a third American round penetrated the rear armor and ignited the fuel tanks. Weber watched from a ditch as his Panther burned, the most sophisticated tank in the German arsenal, destroyed by an American Sherman that everyone had been laughing at just a week earlier. The psychological impact rippled through the German tank units faster than any intelligence report. The Panzer crews had gone into the Ardennes offensive confident in their technical superiority. They'd fought Shermans before. They knew how to kill Shermans. But the EZ-8 changed the equation. Now every American tank was potentially one of these upgraded killers, and you couldn't tell which was which until it fired and penetrated your armor. By early January 1945, as the German offensive ground to a halt and then reversed into retreat, the EZ-8 had become a legend among both sides. American crews requested them specifically. German crews reported them with the same respect they'd previously reserved for Soviet T-34s. Staff Sergeant Joe Kowalski and his crew had destroyed 7 German tanks in 3 weeks, 2 Panzer IVs, 4 Panthers, and 1 Tiger that had made the mistake of exposing its flank in a narrow valley. The 76mm gun had punched through the Tiger's side armor at 400 meters, a kill that would have been impossible with the old 75mm Sherman. "It's not just the gun," Kowalski explained to a reporter who'd come to interview EZ-8 crews. "It's the whole package. We can go places other Shermans can't. We can hit targets while moving. We can penetrate armor that used to shrug off everything we threw at it. For the first time since D-Day, we're not just hoping to get close enough to flank them. We can face them head-on and win." Hans Waldmann, recovering in a field hospital from his wounds, heard the stories from other Panzer crews. The Americans had done what the Germans thought impossible. They'd taken their mediocre tank and transformed it into a war winner through systematic improvement. Not a revolutionary new design, just careful engineering solving specific problems. A better gun, better suspension, wider tracks. Simple changes that added up to a fundamental shift in capability. The irony wasn't lost on Waldmann. The Germans had started the war with superior tanks and superior tactics. They'd maintained that edge through constant innovation, the Panther, the Tiger, advanced optics and fire control, but they'd become complacent about American armor. The Sherman was a joke. The Americans couldn't build a real tank if their lives depended on it. Except they could. They had. And they'd done it not by reinventing the wheel, but by making the wheel that already existed work better. By February 1945, as the Allies pushed back into Germany, the EZ-8 had become standard equipment for American armored units. Production ramped up, and the improved Shermans began replacing the older models throughout the European theater. German tankers who'd once laughed at American armor now treated every Sherman with cautious respect, never knowing if the next one would be an easy kill or an Easy-8 that could punch through their frontal armor. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last great offensive, and it failed for many reasons. Logistics, fuel shortages, American air superiority once the weather cleared, the stubborn defense of key positions like Bastogne. But among the tankers who fought in those frozen forests, there was another reason, one they understood viscerally. The Americans had stopped being victims. Their tanks could fight back. And once that psychological advantage disappeared, the math became simple and brutal. Quality times quantity equals dominance. The Germans still had quality, but they'd lost the monopoly on it. And the Americans had the quantity in overwhelming abundance. The Easy-8 wasn't the tank that won the war. That credit belonged to the entire Allied industrial machine. The millions of soldiers and sailors and airmen, the strategic bombing campaign, the code breakers and the logistics officers, and the countless others who contributed to victory. But in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in that terrible winter of 1944 and 1945, the Easy-8 proved something fundamental. American engineering could innovate. American industry could adapt. And American tankers, given the tools to fight on equal terms, were as deadly as anyone on the battlefield. The German tank crews had laughed at the Sherman for 2 years. By the time the war ended, they weren't laughing anymore.